Our second speaker for today. Paz Guevara is a curator, researcher, and author based in Berlin. She is currently collaborating in the long-term project Kanon Fragen at Haus der Kultur in der Welt. She will also start with sharing with us this institutional, what she has been up to in her institutional role there, and the kinds of projects that are taking place in collaborative curatorial formats, such as the exhibition Parapolitics, Cultural Freedom and the Cold War, which happened 2017-18, and also more recently, Afrosonic Mapping with the musician and artist Sach Hoyt, which is a project that I recently witnessed, and it was really quite an exceptional event for the HKW, and also came through after long-term research by Sach over really interweaving his roles as a musician and also through research interviews and so on, and through performances that he did. So it's great that Paz will talk about this project with us today. Her previous contributions have included the past disquiet narratives and ghosts for the International Art Exhibition for Palestine 1978 project, towards which she contributed research on South American artists, museums, and networks involved in the Solidarity movement. She has also been co-curator of the Latin American Pavilion at the 55th and 54th Venice Biennials, and contributed to several publications. So welcome, Paz. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Natasha. I'm very happy to be again talking with you, and I'm deeply grateful to Priyanka and Pratik for the invitation, and to know this very well-known hub, Experimental Curators Hub, that I had known before digitally. So I'm very happy to be analog and also learning a lot with the curators, artists, colleagues that are presenting. I'm very fascinating to be learning and exchanging with all of you. And I would like also to encourage you to prepare some questions. So with the artists, publishers, authors, and curators that are present, we can develop later this generous half an hour time for questions. So I will tell you some stories today. Every time I share these projects, I feel like in an entropic process, because they are quite complex, research-based exhibitions with many collaborators and many archival materials, as well as historical and contemporary artworks. So feel free to push in certain lines so I can expand. These projects have taken place in Haus der Kultur in der Welt in Berlin, Germany. That I introduce you here at the building because it's also a material protagonist in one of the exhibitions that I will share with you. You will see later on. So as Natasha was introducing, and also very connected with the presentation and the aims that Naomi was sharing with us yesterday, how to question the established, the dominant narratives in the field of art history, I would like to share with you these background questions that were impulsing us in these projects. They are not all the time explicit, so this kind of workshop, seminar opportunity is a way to share part of this backstage that is animating and leading many of our research and the thinking on exhibitions. So how art history has been written, told, and legitimized. What stories are preserved, negotiated, and for whom? So who is behind the power structures behind? How are the foundations of these canon narratives? We will see how, through parapolitics, we reconstruct somehow the hegemonic narrative of formalism and the Eurocentrism, for instance. And finally, instead, of including more chapters or more regions. We had the question if it is possible to do a history of limits, of divisions, of categories. Like we were just discussing in the previous talk, the notion, the category of Southeast Asia. We will see in my talk how we also debated the notion of internationalism that emerged in the Cold War, but with a huge bias, or the Western culture, Western civilization, what it meant, to whom were they getting together, who was in the West and who was in the Northwest or in the East. So the first exhibition that I will share with you is Parapolitics that I curated together with Anselm Franke, Nida Gus, that is also a daily curator based in Berlin now, and Antonia Mayaka, with curatorial collaborators that I will introduce on the way. As you see, there are many contemporary and historical artists participating. So when Natasha approached me to prepare the presentation, I like very much that you told me how to go to visit the exhibitions. So I took this kind of cinematic message, and we are entering now in the foyer, in the first space of Haus der Kultur in der Welt. This is the opening of Parapolitik, and already I invite you to see the materiality beyond the theme or the content of the exhibition was very important for us. Also, how we present it, what is the exhibition performing, what the materials are narrating. This was the introductory wall. I will tell you more. And we display various magazines with areas of reading that you can consult them. So also trying to break with the vitrines that you were telling yesterday, but in a mixed way. And here we enter in the first space of the exhibition. I will return to this. And now if we would have this first glance of the space of the exhibition and we draw our attention, we will start seeing what is the departing point of this project. We were following a very little known organization founded in 1950 in West Berlin. It became important all the time to mark there was the West. Before, we were approaching Berlin, Germany, and in the story you will see that becomes important to start making differentiations in West Berlin. This was the Congress for Cultural Freedom in 1950 in June. They were a group of intellectuals that proclaim this manifesto to defend freedom, to contest the peace conference run by the Communist Party. In this conference in Berlin, they approach artists and intellectuals to leave the position of neutrality and to take a position and publish this manifesto proclaiming freedom. I will now return. One of the main magazines that supported this starting conference of what they were called the non-communist left intellectuals was the magazine The Monad, that was covertly founded by the CIA. And in the last document that Natasha was involved, also Jonas Mekat had this historical photo where you see the poster in the year 48 in Kassel, for example, of this magazine, to imagine how it circulated. So this Congress for Cultural Freedom ran more than 50 magazines around the world, from Chile, where I'm from, also in India, I will share with you, in Paris, Italy, South Korea, we will see. They also organize and supporting exhibitions. I will share with you some stories, and many conferences with what they call international intellectuals of the, they didn't highlight the politics because this was part of the operation, was uncover of the non-communist left. What happened is that after 17 years of activities of supporting more than 200 conferences, exhibitions, and magazines, it was disclosed that the CIA was financing this Western enterprise, and became quite clear there was somehow to contest the Soviet also dominance of culture. Here is the director of the cultural division of the CIA at that time, Thomas Braden, that previously also had a short 1 year and a half in MoMA working, with the very polemic title, "I'm glad the CIA is immoral." For him, they save the Western art. So for him, they made, he said it in the interview, damn well done job, something like this. And at that time was published how the CIA was supporting in a cover way many universities, institutes of research, among them this Congress for Cultural Freedom. So we return to the exhibition. If we imagine that we have entered in this introductory wall, we have read a bit on this Congress and the lists of all these activities that they were initiating, supporting, organizing, and now we are in the first of the exhibition. We see the video at the end by artist Lene Berg. She developed this video, as you see, in 2006, and many times artists also as researchers, they have done steps further than the historians, and this is one of the cases. So Lene Berg founded, through the research, the wife of the main director of this Congress for Cultural Freedom, called Michael Joselson. She somehow managed to obtain an interview with her, that is Diana Joselson that we see in the screen. And there she testified how they had double life. So she would say, I was so proud that my husband got this job, we will travel around the world. But many times I had to cover him. I have to say, no, 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 the CIA is not involved. We're a philanthropic institution. So we had double life, she testifies. And Lene Berg also intervened with the research. One of the main magazines that this group initiated was the magazine Encounter. She retitled it, so recontextualized it, changing the perspective as Gentlemen and Ashlocks. And inside of the magazine, she inserted the research with the connection with the liaison of the CIA that was not mentioned at that time. So we have also this magazine with a little table in a situation that you could go through and read. And other artists that had worked beyond the historical convention, so to say, is the Chilean artist Voluspa Jarpa. She have done a series of interventions of books of history, including, as you see, in the language of a sculptor and installation, the CIA documents that have not been considered to narrate these histories. Like in around the year 2000, US disclosed thousands of documents with the involvement of the CIA and South America. Voluspa Jarpa had the hope that many historians then will rewrite these corresponding chapters, acknowledging this involvement. But this didn't happen. Her response was a series of books with the history of Brazil, like in this case, but also the series goes on with history books of Chile, Colombia, Venezuela, Guatemala. This work is very interesting. Doug Ashford was part of group material. They were very critical to the US invasion and intervention in South America from the 50s, like in 53, they intervened in Guatemala. And if we start looking at the history of this Congress, start appearing the contradictions. So in this exhibition, we wanted to reconstruct this story, but also expose the contradictions, the debates, the ambiguities, and this very challenging position that artists and intellectuals had between instrumentalization, autonomy, critique, and engagement. So Doug Ashford that had participated in group material, for example, they did posters where they listed all the US interventions in the Caribbean and South America. Nevertheless, he had one topic that he had never addressed of his own biography. So when I met him in New York to talk about what he would do, he started thinking, then he corresponded with all of us later on, and he proposed us to address one issue, that was that, in fact, his father had worked for the CIA. So his father was a professor of a prestigious university, I don't remember now which one, and in parallel, had joined the CIA, the cultural branch. So was kind of in the network of Tom Braden that I introduced you earlier. And in this work, he asked the mother, these are the letters, why my father joined the CIA? And these are the responses. And sometimes they're quite similar with these patriotic hopes that Diana Yotzelson, the widow of the director of the Congress, the CCF, let's say in short, the CCF had. She said, we were married and we started to have a family, so it was so great that your father could serve the nation also in this second job. So they have this idealism that he shared to problematize also this story from his own biography, and also to open up the story of this cultural branch of the CIA that affect, and that we had questioned here, who pays the programs, who is behind. It's a book by Stonor Sanders, a British journalist, entitled Who Paid the Piper, that is approaching in extent this story, for example. And it's a fascinating artist, Susanne Trister, that we gave her carte blanche. And we were very surprised when we received the work. And we decided to install all this kind of what I call the CIA logos in the position outside of the exhibition walls where these logos normally are there, the logo that had never been included. I hope I will do something here. And related to the materiality of the exhibition, we visited several exhibitions dedicated to the period of the Cold War, and many of them were installed with huge white walls, very solid. And as a metaphor of a white page where you inscribe more chapters or more information, somehow in an affirmative way to the structures and the museum displays. So as we were more interested in questioning these narratives and structures, we developed with the designer of SAC Group a wall that would be incomplete. So you see the materials are not even, and with another materiality, like steel with this transparent material, but that nevertheless you cannot see is also an opacity. It's not completely transparent. Somehow to rework this unit of this modernistic unit of the White Cube Museum displayed, and somehow have more like a construction site as exhibition materiality. So we return now. So exhibiting the contradictions is very connected to what Naomi presented yesterday, this discourse of freedom financed by the US CIA, the Central Intelligence, start having many critics, especially from South America, Asia, and Africa, but also internally due to the segregation and racism in their own countries, so how they could promote freedom if they don't respect their own citizens. So this is a work by Norman Lewis that had a reverse, that is a kind of, I don't have the image of the other side, like an ideal middle-class home. So you have this somehow American dream that is only for some. And I will not expand because Naomi really made a wonderful presentation yesterday. And here only to approach the freedom discourse. So Howardina Pindell, obviously, in making a kind of irony, because free, white, and 21 was only a condition to be celebrated by some, that they could have all the possibilities and conditions and not for everybody. And we follow different lines. Since this Congress expanded through 35 offices and so many activities, many intellectuals were engaged, and one of them was Richard Wright. The Authorlit Group made the research on the archives of Richard Wright and developed a project in the exhibition. And here we have the color cartine, that is the report by Wright on the Bandung conference, and it is historical evidence that the trip to the conference was paid by this Congress for cultural freedom. This does not mean that any of these authors and artists knew where the money was coming from. I was very relieved when I was reading one book and the historian said, we will never know who knew and who didn't know. So I said, okay, it's fine. I'm relieved, I don't need to look. Because at the beginning, when I was researching in the Chicago library, I was sharing with Naomi yesterday, like reading all the letters, if I find some detail, some evidence, but of course these letters probably were deleted. So it's almost very difficult to find a trace. And I will focus in the next minutes very quickly in the second space of the exhibition, where we approach the exhibition as a medium. So what were these exhibitions that this CCF organized were performing? Which style, which aesthetic debates, and what were the politics, because this is very interlaced. So here you see at the right, the Museum of American Art. Is an amazing museum run by an artist that is in Berlin and is dedicated to reproduce the Formalist collection of MoMA. So we could display the Malevich that were presented in one in the first exhibition of the CCF entitled Masterpieces of the 20th Century. It's very interesting that this exhibition that I will show you let us enter in an earlier chapter in the Cold War, before Documenta 1, that was in 1955. So the exhibition was first at the Musée National d'Art Moderne in Paris, and later at Tate. So I think did not overlook at that time. And here, to pick up some of the debates of yesterday, I was very intrigued, like why they selected the painting of Rousseau, that is not totally abstract, for the poster. And by digging in the conferences that were accompanying the exhibition, it was the definition that figuration that is not mimetic, that is not referring to the reality, lead you to the imaginary. So then it's not realism. So this kind of imaginary portrait and landscape of Rousseau also become fundamental in this debate of abstraction and realism, for example. And imagine that I was so excited that I found a video of the exhibition. This is a totally unknown exhibition, and in the library in Paris, it was a film. So here is the entrance of the exhibition. But unfortunately, the cameraman had really no sensitivity of the medium, so he captured almost all the 2 hours, like not even with the frame, but it helps you to see what was the selection of artworks. And it's important to just to recognize how they re-signify modernism, that we know more by the history of Documenta in the period. So the artists that were considered degenerate in the National Socialism, in the Nazi time, here will be framed under the concept of freedom, innovation, and individualism, and internationalism. So we start seeing how this category start to come together. Leger, very short, very cropped Duchamp, etc. Miro and Juan Gris. Mondrian, the same Mondrian was in Documenta later, and it's interesting that this Mondrian was already painted in New York, so you see how many of the avant-garde artists of that time already had moved from Europe to United States. To unpack these exhibitions, we also exhibited the archival material, the press release, for example. And here we start like making discourse analysis to see how they use categories, and we could see here that the exhibition was somehow framed as a contribution of Western culture. I will read it so it's clear for you. The purpose of the exhibition is to bring into focus the richness of our half-century's contribution to Western culture, a contribution which we believe would not have been possible except the climate of freedom. And then is the alliance with the concept of freedom, in which the great artists, composers, and writers of our time have worked. The exhibition mainly was the only Russian artist that they included also in the music part, because it was a festival where Russian artists that had left the Soviet Union or that they were suppressed. So it was the only way to enter in this Western category if you were really not a part of the Soviet Union system. And here in this next fragment, they will address the resignification of modernism. In short, here they say that the 120 paintings and sculptures had been not presented in the last 50 years because they were forbidden. And this allows them to somehow build the context of what they meant by freedom. So freedom from somehow the National Socialism and the Soviet Union. So you have this resignification of modernism in the Cold War scenario and binarism. They developed, very interestingly, a series of exhibitions that they entitled Young Painters. And in one of the sections, they have a didactic introduction where you see already Pollock and dripping the action painting as part of the canon of the isms. So you see how United States also managed to enter one chapter in the Eurocentric history of art via this new ism, the abstract expressionism, mainly of Jackson Pollock. And here we start also seeing how this notion of internationalism was contextualized. So Herbert Reed wrote in the catalog, he was part of the CCF, so was permanent habitué in conferences and programs. He wrote, the style in which these artists paint is no longer distinctively French, it is international. So, of course, after National Socialism was the less cool thing to say, nationalism. And internationalism became this brand associated to freedom, but with a lot of restrictions and biases, because Soviet artists were only invited if they were renegating to the communism. So they continued doing these exhibitions dedicated to abstract art. And it's interesting that they insisted that all these artists were not political, that abstract art was apolitical. And here Herbert Reed explained how. The struggle, the exhibition here was entitled Antagonism. So for us today, this will sound very political exhibition. So how he managed to make it not political? So the struggle is spiritual and not political, and the rivalries are individual and not national. Then he continued, contemporary painting is authentic insofar as the painter discovered this free form, like inside, you know. Today we are quite sure, based on research of modern psychologists, that this form must be discovered in the very spirit of the artist. Like, you're struggling with yourself and not with the context. Nevertheless, I found very funny that a reviewer in the French press said, these young painters have claimed total liberty, this total freedom, and here they are dangerously limited to themselves. So we wanted to address all these debates. We have short time. In one section, we turn to the 30s. That is the emergence of the formalist paradigm. We have Alfred Barr paradigm, that all the isms, this is from 36, are marching towards abstraction, so geometric or non-geometric abstraction. Many artists of that time didn't like to be in this diagram. Like Molinoche replied to Barr, I don't want to be in this march towards abstraction. Or Kandinsky said, you visited my studio. Didn't you understand the spirituality of my work? Then, in a similar year, 37, is the Degenerate Art Exhibition, where all the avant-garde was classified, categorized as degenerate, childish, Jewish, Bolshevik. And then we have this resignification in the 50s with the exhibitions that I was showing you. And the Guernica by Picasso. So in the debate of formalism, we wanted also to show this little, not that hegemonic contestation that the Marxist art historian Meyer Shapiro, in short, he contested Barr as an art history that is inherent without considering the context. Even the artwork, he said, that claims total freedom is free due to some conditions, like what also Foucault had explained in discourse and knowledge and power, the power structures behind this claim of freedom. And HKW as a building enter in the story to close the circle, since the building of where is HKW originally was called Kongresshalle, was built in 1957 and was a present of United States to West Berlin, and was very close to the Soviet section, and somehow materially was celebrating the reunion, the democratic exchanges. And here the CCF celebrated the 10 years anniversary in our building. And this is a photo where it's Alfred Barr that came specially to celebrate the 10 years anniversary together with other art critics of the time. They're ironically debating about the founding in art, probably without knowing that their own tickets and hotels were paid by the CIA. We'll skip this. And we follow several histories of exhibitions of the period. And at the end, very shortly before the disclosure, Clement Greenberg accompanied the exhibition 2 Decades of American Painting. Clement Greenberg was also a member of the CCF. So it's interesting that through this Congress, you start somehow politicizing an art history and actors that claim themselves to be very apolitical and only dedicated to the form and the plain, as is the discourse of Greenberg. And he wrote what is called here the India Report. There are fascinating 7 pages. And here he claimed, artists all over the non-communist world are avant-garde today, especially those in the generation under 40. So here we see that for them, internationalism was only in the non-communist countries. So it's interesting to double-check the biennials today, the exhibitions that claim internationalism, what kind of internationalism they are repeating, appropriating, or problematizing, how many artists of historically Eastern Bloc are really present. And to show also different approaches to abstract art, how also had been political. So is the example of Armando Morales. He somehow made an appropriation and homage to Motherwell, that was one of the main artists in all these US traveling exhibitions, like in the one in India, but acknowledging that the Motherwell was in fact not only was an abstract artist, but political. If you see the title, Elegy to the Spanish Republic, is dealing exactly with the Guernica context, with the Spanish Civil War, but somehow this is erased in the very framework of these traveling MoMA exhibitions. And Armando Morales dedicating his painting to a guerrillero muerto also repoliticized abstraction. Fidel Castro said at that time also, our enemies are capitalists and imperialists, not abstract art. So dealing also with this third position that we were debating yesterday, and how to problematize and not only reconstruct the hegemonic discourse, but also to open up these other stories that are beyond this binarism. And perhaps to finish, so we had a very interesting approach to conceptual art in the period. This is Art and Language, Picasso's Guernica in the style of Jackson Pollock. Just to also, Tom Braden called, the CIA member, called the battle at the time of the Cold War, the battle for Picasso's mind, because Picasso, in 1944, joined the Communist Party. But he was also fundamental for Alfred Barr narrative. It was so fundamental that in this exhibition, Barr put a photocopy of the Mademoiselle d'Avignon, because really needed this work from 1907 as the trigger from Cubism, figuration to abstraction. So they were battling for Picasso. And in this work, we see how conceptualism alliances also with our practice of re-narrating. Here they somehow collapse the both language of the icons of the period, the action painting by Pollock and the Guernica by Picasso, in a way making a portrait of their own distance to the debate between abstraction and figuration. Luis Kamitzer, another conceptual artist, said, I was very happy to read this in his book of the conceptualism of the South, said, finally with conceptualism we got rid of this very boring conversation between abstraction and figuration. So we were safe, finally. This is other examples, perhaps I skip. The photo is not here. Okay. So Sheila Gauda, I wanted to share with you, I did the photo today, maybe therefore it didn't work. Artists that approach abstraction in their own terms, so reframing it. We have Daniel Buren here in the right, maybe appear in the conversation, and Sheila Gauda with the shrine to the black square and other abstractions. It's a shrine also with the stripes in red, where you access and you see a similar appropriated black square by Malevich, but of course she's exploding abstraction as formalism in the way that is also a ritual and has a broader context and localities that are your own. You think, Natasha, we finish here? We have 5 minutes or 2 minutes?
Okay, I will just pause it.
Yes. Exactly. It's a long story. I can talk like 8 hours, I think.
Let's start now.
Still more.
Our idea actually didn't completely go through because we wanted to actually discuss 2 projects by Paz. But since this specific collaborative project is so dense, the presentation time has been taken up with that. So we could do this in 2 ways. One is that let's take a few questions, if there are from you all, that pertain to this presentation. And then in, say, the last 10 minutes we have, I would request Paz to give a very brief kind of outlining of the Afrosonic mapping project, because it has a very different strategy, which in a way also, personally, I feel has been crucial to bring into something, an organization like the Hakaway. So it would be great to at least highlight both in a way.
Let's do that. So as you see, I have a series of more archival materials to discuss, but perhaps if you have a question, it would be helpful to take some red threads.
I had 2 naive questions. One was concerning the artistic complicity. Like you mentioned that we would never know the truth, whether they were aware of where the funding was coming from. But just the fact that the funding was coming from the CIA, is it like enough to also discredit the artists' viewpoints and conceptualizations? Because surely they would, especially those that were not familiar with this tie-up with the CIA and CIA's involvement, they would be formulating original ideas. So does that sort of like discredit those ideas which were formulated under this thing that was like fired up by the CIA? So just the question of artistic sort of complicity in this. And the second was how to look at this now when internationalism is sort of garnering new interest, and you know, philosophers like Boris Kreuz are having a relook at it, and they're sort of interested in the systematic discrediting of internationalism as a movement. So yeah, just these 2 questions.
Yeah. Thank you. So we were not interested in artists that participated in these finance exhibitions, but more in artists that from their own aesthetic means and political position had to struggle between these two dominant paradigms. You have to imagine if you would have been in the 50s, in the post-war, there have been very little possibilities. Countries are under reconstruction, and suddenly you have these institutions that support, but certain kind of art. So, but nevertheless, many artists contested this very reduced view and understanding of abstraction. For example, I can tell you the story of Daniel Buren that looks very simple abstraction, these stripes, white and blue. But in fact, this work comes from '72 when he was exhibiting in Documenta 5, curated by legendary Hagal Seman. And nevertheless, Daniel Buren confronted the curatorial framework and said, you are treating the artworks as a raw material. In fact, you are the artist, like the meta-artist. But the curator that was wise responded, okay, give me a proposal, what we can do? And the artist that worked also wisely, came with a proposal and made these stripes, but as a wall paper. So he covered the wall, again, this unit of the modern way of a museum display, and went, for example, behind the painting of Jasper Johns and other works. So it was not any more clear when a work begins and when ends. So somehow he hacked one of the conventions of exhibition making in modern terms, via this abstraction becoming political and an institutional critique. So we were focusing in this kind of artists that found and created space despite these very two dominant paradigms between abstraction and socialist realism. And your second question of internationalism, I agree, like after looking this genealogy, how the term emerged, as curators and artists, we have to be more careful and political to celebrate internationalism by knowing what it meant at this period and how contemporary art somehow still hunted by these questions. So if we take them with responsibility, as Zoe was answering in this interview, we should also question these notions.
Can you hear me? I'm at an institution that has benefited in some ways years ago, decades ago, from the largesse of the CIA. I'm not sure knowingly or how unknowingly Whitechapel Gallery in London participated in receiving a number of exhibitions in the 1950s and early 60s from artists like Pollock, Rothko, Gustin, among others, that originated in the US and toured internationally under the auspices of the US Information Agency, which was part of the CIA. And we did mount an exhibition a couple of years ago about the Pollock exhibition of 1958. One of the things I was interested in and curious about is the disjunctures of some of these institutions and the kind of slippages in the presentation. While the CIA perhaps funded some of the tour costs, they didn't pay all the costs, and the mounting of the exhibitions may not have been in the way that MoMA or the US Information Agency would have approved. For example, in this Pollock exhibition, the architect was commissioned to design some walls, and the cheapest way to build walls in the post-war period in Britain was to use cinder block. So rather than having pristine white walls, the Pollock paintings hung on cinder block or on fabric, because fabric was a good way of covering up any holes in your walls, so you wouldn't have to redo them every time. So I'm wondering if you found any other evidence of some of the kind of ways in which some of these exhibitions may be circulated and didn't cohere or adhere to the vision of,
It's fascinating to hear. We didn't find further stories as the one you are telling, but for example, in Greenberg, when he came with one of these exhibitions to India, he received like a huge contestation. So the magazine Contra published somehow a response telling how they were trying to influence Indian artists, and they were proposing an art to export. And this is what they meant by internationalism. So it was possible sometimes to find the responses, so how the exhibitions were received. But in this case, this report comes from the Smithsonian Archive. It's a folder called Congress for Cultural Freedom in the section of Clement Greenberg. He has also other reports. And after we exhibited, we received the request of turning it down, just the page of the report, because the archive said literally, we didn't know that you were making an issue with that. So I think the stories are difficult to find and to research, but for example, also the DAD, that is an exchange, academic exchange organization in Germany, also founded in the 60s. The director told me at the beginning, also DAD was involved also in the history of the CIA. And when she came to the opening, I hugged her, I said, thank you for coming. And I made a joke, you're lucky that I didn't find time to research. I saved your reputation. Because we couldn't follow all the stories, because as the diagram that I show you was quite extent. So this is one story that have a response, for example.
Should we transition to just the last segment in 10 minutes?
Maybe I would like to share the Indian magazines as a transition. So they made all these almost 50 magazines, and just to be in situ, to be locally, to share with you these local debates. So this Congress was founded on the 50s, and immediately you see 51, they came to Bombay with one of their conference, the first Asian conference for cultural freedom. And it's very interesting because when Nehru declared neutralism, it was like a trigger for this Congress to try to conquest these hearts and minds for the West, because they didn't declare Western or in the Eastern Bloc. So India was one of the first places that members of this Congress came, and they made alliances with the Socialist Party leaders that became members. And although Nehru continued declaring neutralism, you see in the magazine how they capture the secretary of the CCF saying hello to Nehru, somehow framing him as an ally. So you have these tensions and this imagery to try to capture him at their side. And they also developed the magazine Freedom First. And later on, the magazine Quest, that I don't have here, I think. There are several stories. For example, immediately they came in '53 to Chile, where I'm from, to contest the power of Pablo Neruda, very strong member of the Communist Party that had organized previously the Conferencia Continental de la Cultura. So it was like a battle of conferences, a battle of festivals and exhibitions. Only so you see some stories that are multifold. So now I'm happy to change. So this will be a tour de force to get into the other, all the magazines that this Congress supported in different countries. This is Quest also here in Calcutta. All the quests are online. So if somebody has interest, it's ready to be read. Australia, Africa, Nigeria, Mexico, Lebanon, Kampala, South Africa, London. This was dedicated to South America, to Spanish speakers. Philippines. Okay. So here we are. So I will share with you the Afrosonic mapping. It's a project by the artist and musician Sach Hoyt that departed from a research that he shared in this blog. in a colonial archive in Berlin, in the Ethnological Museum. He researched the oldest archives of African music and selected a section on West African music that had been preserved and conserved, but little shown and shared. He obtained the permission to have digital copies, and his project was a kind of restitution and liberation of these archives, to take them outside of the cabinet. And the mapping consisted in to return these files to the places where this music had been captured, in today Angola and Congo. And here we see how he met contemporary musicians, filmmakers, and authors, and did listening sessions to share this music. Many of the musicians were with full emotion, because it was a way to contact with their ancestors, the instruments, the melodies, the rhythms, and how they're still very present, but some gaps still exist. For example, the instrument lamellophone, that Satchhoit was very interested to learn more in his trip to Angola. At the end, he was teaching the Angolan musicians lamellophone. Like Angola won independence only in 1975, so still the infrastructures and the recovery of their own histories and practices is very ongoing. Beyond the listening sessions where he shared these recordings that were originally in phonogram, in wax cylinders, he also did recording sessions, and with contemporary musicians, via the sampling technique, that is a kind of deconstructed device. They select some fragments or layers of these original recordings and mix them with contemporary interventions by musicians. So here he's with MC Sacerdote in a studio in Angola, with the guitarist Teddy Nisinski in Angola. Then, as Naomi was telling us yesterday, in this more Pan-Africanist framework, he followed the forced migration from Angola to, for example, Salvador de Bahia and Lisbon, the Lusophone, the Portuguese-speaking former colonies and today post-colonies. And here is working with the guitarist Estuya Nascimento, adding new layers to these musical compositions. So in the project in Hakave, we open an exhibition to inhabit, to experience with different modes of perception. Live program consisted in the group of musicians that met for the first time from Angola, Salvador de Bahia, and Lisbon. And in one hand, they interpreted these paintings. The title of the sound's performance is Procession. So paintings by Satchhoit that are, they have like 3 lives. So they are cartographies of the African diaspora. Although you see at the first glance that they're very abstract, so we enter again in this conversation. They are also always zones. May I have another picture? They're always zones and transfers, movements, flows. So it's somehow a mapping, a cartography of the African diaspora between the continents. But also there are notation systems. And he invited many of these musicians to improvise at the opening. And they are also what Satchhoit calls celestial constellations, in the way that connects you with the ancestors. For example, when we were doing a tour of the exhibition, a group of students tell us, I feel, a student told me, I feel that it's like a totem. We did this vertical hanging that connects paintings in this kind of embracing way, like we call it also a floating amphitheater. So the perception was not only for the eyes, that is also a Western dominant paradigm. So we try also to confront not only like with discourse, category against category, but also in the way that you perceive and how to make an exhibition that you inhabit, and not only that is directed to the eye. So here you potentially perceive it as a whole, and then emerge this interpretation of the totem. Here's a group of students. In the center was this platform that we call it also an altar, a stage where the artists perform on the last day. And in this group, they felt that they were in a spaceship. So taking this Afro-futuristic imagination, and that the paintings were the landscape that you were seeing through this journey. So somehow many of the visitors travel again the journey that Sajhoy had done himself. And we had an amazing round of talks. You see here Jihan El-Tahiri, Greg Tate, Kilwanjiki Ahenda, the concert where the musicians reunite for the first time. And we closing program with Sach on the stage, and the talks with Fred Moten and Rui Vieira Neri.
We're out of time. Are there any pressing questions on the second project?
The India report, is there any way to access it? Because I'm trying to look it up. Can you send it to me?
I'm not allowed because I signed a document.
Oh no! Can you post that again? I was trying to take a picture and blow it up and read.
You can call me and I read it to you.
Who the Indian art critics, he says there are only two who don't see it such a big deal. Do you know?
Well, let me see.
67, right? So, what would it be? Maybe going.
How is the question again?
So he writes about how Indian artists are just mimicking Western abstractionism and don't seem to care about it when questioned. And the two.
You read from there?
Two genuine art critics, as distinguished from journalists of India, do not repeat it or take this allegation seriously.
Well, the contestation, I don't know if I told you the name. So in contra, I wrote it here. So Giv Patel was the Giv Patel was the one that responded, criticizing this exportable art, and that they present with the ambition, he said, to be art of the century, this international art. And the editor of the magazine that also intervened was Yadesh Shmanimtan. Yeah, artist and editor of the magazine. And the Contra magazine, this is online in the Asia archive. We can do a secret reading of the India report.
If I could just, as a just a quick, so my understanding of U.S. Information Agency, U.S. and USIS, is that it was created separate from the Central Intelligence Agency. Not to say that there has not been funding when they were in existence, but and I don't know if there was confusion. There was also before that the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, which was from 1942 to 1945, where Julia Child was a part of that, if you guys have read her autobiography. But the idea of public diplomacy with USIA and USIS was actually to separate that from that space. So I only say that as a public diplomacy historian there.
Yeah, this exhibition is good that you brought up the concept were meant as a cultural diplomacy. So it's... Yeah, they were meant as public diplomacy. Yeah, and they were very interlaced, the political agenda with the support that this exhibition had and not other ones. So if you were a figurative artist in the 50s and 60s, maybe you had not been promoted, or if you were an abstract artist like at Reinhardt, but you were critical to the establishment by concrete actions, you would also not be invited to this traveling exhibition. So I did some double check. So at Reinhardt was the only one that was going to the protest to demand civil rights. So he was also a friend of many Afro-American artists. He was never invited, although he was extraordinarily abstract. He made a series of only black paintings, for example, like a monk. We had one artist, Michael Byers, that approached this story. So the meditative acting of Reinhardt, but also his solitary praxis at the end at his studio. So this is another other way to enter in the story who was not in the story.
There is one slide about Solidarity Journal. So can you just show one?
Which one?
Solidarity.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, from the Philippines.
Is it from Philippines?
What is the question?
Is it? No, I want to see that one. Just yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Perhaps before we close, we are near it's 1 minute to the end of the official end. Like in the case of the Afrosonic mapping, also to relate it with the construction of categories, but building up other narratives. So not only to stay in the critique, but how to unfold these other stories without being all-encompassing, because it's therefore it's a collaborative work. So I found it very important, the operation of such of restituting, so bringing back these archives, but also in the way that he challenged and modified the value related to the past in these conventional and colonial archives. So for them, African, South American, and Asian artifacts or objects are only valuable in relation to the past. So somehow the project Afrosonic Mapping made this ontological shift to make them relevant as contemporary praxis and understanding culture as a living activity and not only as a dead archive. So I like very much when Sach was sharing in a radio program how he took them out of the cabinet. So addressing this cabinet of curiosities that develop in the historical and ethnographic museum, and how you can unsettle the archive, in the words of Stuart Hall, when he's reflecting and questioning how you deal with heritage from museums and historical archives. So this operation of unsettling, I wanted to share before we go for lunch. This journal, for example, is online. There are many of the journals that have been digitized. So with patience, you can download them.
By chance, the Solidarity is there online?
No, this was very difficult. Like Berlin is an amazing resource of libraries, also because of the Cold War history. So it's two state libraries, the one of the former East and the former West. So we were able to find many magazines, whether or in these archives, but others, we work hard to get some copies. For example, in South Korea, that the name is in Korean, was very difficult even to try to look. In this case, we collaborated with Kim Jung-Kim, and she wrote the short story and the research on the South Korean magazine, and Rasha Salti was also a curator contributor, we credit them, in the Lebanese magazine. We are doing a catalog to try to try to close the circle. So you will be the ideal readers if you have interest. It is many authors struggling with also the vocabulary. When you try to tell the story, you don't want to sound like a cold warrior. So sometimes sometimes become difficult to tell the story because the words are stolen also.
Yeah, we'll have to close the session, but feel free to have a few more minutes also to exchange for the lunch break, and then we'll be coming back for the last two presentations.
Thank you.